Welcome to another episode of Experience the Truth, guys. I'm basically going to be a student in this one. I'm going to pass it off to Pastor James because this is his connection, and I'm really excited for the guest that we have today. Do you want to intro our guest?
Yeah, I think I will. You know, a few months ago, actually, I had the opportunity to go to Turkey, and as many of you know, when we did More Than a Book, we were in Israel, and while we were in Israel, we kind of crossed paths with Jeremy, who we're going to talk to today a little bit, and he's a very passionate individual, someone that I can appreciate. I love the passion he has for biblical history and really studying it to get it right. And when we were in Turkey, we were he led the tour. He was the one who kind of took us as we went to place to place. He really fleshed it out and gave us perspective from a biblical standpoint, different than most tour guides. They just tell you the historical context of where you're at. Jeremy really was the connecting to the biblical stuff. This guy's been a pastor. Many argue that he would get a doctorate in areas that there's no one else could actually be his advisor in, because he really knows that much stuff about all of it, and teaches at North Central, which is here in Minneapolis, as well as I'm sure Evangel and out in California at some of the Bible colleges out there. We had a great opportunity in Turkey to be with him and the professor that he was with, and which was an interesting dynamic watching them talk about different things in their class. So I asked Jeremy to come on because he's with Center of Holy Land Studies, and we're going to Israel in September. And if you want to come with us, you don't have to be part of Bethel's Rock to do that. If you're part of our online campus, come join us. We're going in September, and you say, well, there's a war going on in Israel. Well, hopefully it's not going on then. If it is, other things we're going to Israel, and the plan is September, even if we got to move it. But encourage you to sign up. You should take a pilgrimage back to this land. And then when you make the connection to the biblical Bible in the Holy Land, it's just, you will never read it the same. And Jeremy is going to be there, which is huge. It's like having Taylor Swift with you on this tour. So all the Swifties out there, you need to join us, right? But they do a podcast at the Center of Holy Land Studies, and Jeremy's not always in there in the podcast, but he's on it quite often. And when you listen to it, it is just really enlightening to how we read the Bible. And I was listening to a podcast that they were doing on Zechariah. And before we get into the Christmas story, there's a lot of things we grew up believing about the Christmas story. And just like in the Bible, there's a lot of things we believe. And then when you go there, you realize, whoa, wait a minute. I've been trying to interpret the Bible either through tradition of what was passed on to me or my 21st century perspective, and trying to put that in the lens of that. And when you go there, the writer was writing from a perspective that we don't have. And it's guys like Jeremy and people who study that era of time that help us really grab hold of what might have been true and not true. So I proposed this to Alex. I said, that TV show Fact or Fiction, we'll tell the story, and then the guy says fact, or that's not true at all. And this is actually the way it went.
With those sound effects.
Yeah.
By the way, I would love for every time. Yeah. So Jeremy, when you intro, we're going to have Pastor James.
No. I think you should, on your little sound box.
The soundboard.
You should do like something. And anyway, but before we get into Fact or Fiction, there was a podcast they did, and you can go online and watch the Center of Holy Land Study on Zechariah. And I'm going to give you a little opportunity to Jeremy. So if you're out there, give him a hand. Jeremy's here, and would love for you to maybe give us a little highlight to that podcast you did in Zechariah about what his name means and all of that stuff. That was just incredible.
Absolutely. I mean, Zechariah, when it comes to the Christmas story, Zechariah is one of my favorite characters who does not show up in the story when we usually retell it or we talk about it, very rarely, maybe in a Christmas play or something, him and Elizabeth will kind of be these background characters. But we forget the importance, especially in Luke's gospel, that is placed upon them, especially based off the fact that Zechariah is the father of John the Baptist, the one who is called to prepare the way of the Lord. And for those who speak Hebrew, there's something about Zechariah's name that immediately pops into your head as soon as his name is said, because the Hebrew verb for to remember is zakar. And anytime where you have a name with that ending, you have the reality of it placing a connection with God, Yahweh. You see it with Jeremiah, Isaiah. All of these endings are something connected with Yahweh. And so Zakar, Yah, would be the Lord or Yahweh remembers.
Wow.
And when we have that mindset, we have to understand what's taking place in that moment. Because when we look at the angel that comes and appears in front of Zechariah as he's working inside the temple as a priest, he says Zechariah's name first, and he declares it. And that declaration, yes, it's his name, but it's also the declaration that Yahweh has not forgotten his promise. And what is the promise? Well, that's the promise that we see all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. When the fall of mankind, you find the beginning of the messianic promise and the revelation of the Messiah throughout the entirety of the Old Testament. The purpose of the Old Testament is to point Israel, and therefore the world, with Israel serving as a proxy or a go-between between God and the nations, to the Messiah. And so what is being stated in that moment is that Yahweh has not forgotten about all of this. Now, we add another layer to that because you're coming out of a period that is oftentimes called the 400 years of silence, where
Right.
God isn't necessarily silent. He's working in between the scenes, but it's the fact that you don't have canonical writing, or you don't have really books of the Bible that are being produced or happening in between these 400 years. So for this period, God has been silent to many people's understandings, and now finally he's not only no longer silent, but he's announcing the proclamation that he hasn't forgotten about his people, and that the time to fulfill that promise that he made thousands of years earlier has come to pass now.
Wow. That's a way to read the Bible.
You know what's interesting, and I, this is a Christmas podcast.
Yeah.
But what Jeremy's bringing up right now, what he's talking about, when we were in Turkey, that whole 400 years that he's talking about, God's there may not be authors and books that are occurring, but God's still working, and Turkey was really the evidence of that. Can you because this is maybe another podcast, but even during that period of time, God was probably doing his best work during that period of time when people weren't hearing. What's going on during that 400-year period when we think God isn't speaking?
Oh, yeah, God is setting up. Basically, I look at it almost like these bowling pins, that God is setting up the pins for them to be knocked down during the age of the New Testament. And you have the reality of God using the nations of the world to create the world that is needed for the gospel to spread at the premium ability. I mean, you try to spread the gospel today, you're going to hear words like fake news and things like that happening. You need a time period where people's hearts are prepared, but also their minds and their cultures are prepared as well. So let's take, for example, what God does with the establishment of Alexander the Great's empire. Alexander the Great, in 10 years, creates the largest empire that the world had ever seen. And in doing so, he unifies the language of the Mediterranean world, that all of them are now speaking Greek.
Yeah.
So when we look at the New Testament is written completely in Greek because it's a common language that if you're in Spain, if you're in Turkey, if you're in Israel, if you're in Alexandria, Egypt, you're all speaking that same language. You might have another language in the background, but everybody speaks that language. Then we look at the establishment, for example, of the Roman Empire or the Roman Republic, where you have the building of a mass network of road systems. We hear this term, all roads lead to Rome, but it creates an ability to transport the gospel by by foot throughout the ancient world or throughout the New Testament world that we see Paul doing when Paul's working and bringing the gospel to places inland, or not even Paul, but other missionaries that we don't necessarily read about in the New Testament, but we know they have to be evident when we see thriving churches in places like Smyrna, Pergamum, Sardis that are all being planted that Paul never goes to. Somebody else has to plant them, that they're using these road systems to be able to bring the gospels along. And with the road systems then comes the postal system, which is huge when we look at the New Testament. Most of the New Testament that we have is letters. That's all going through this postal system that's being created supernaturally by God behind the scenes by the hands of man in our temporal understanding, that brings about the spread of the gospel in a way that would not have been possible 400, 300 years before Jesus ever came.
Wow.
Yeah. You think God might just be pretty intentional.
Yeah.
He knows what he's doing.
Yeah.
I mean, when you think about that, I think when I hear him, Jeremy, say that again, I hear you say that again, it reminds me of how little we know about the history around biblical history. How you have to know history in order to recognize that the Bible is written within, it wasn't in a vacuum. It was within this historical context of everything else that's going around it. Let's go to the Christmas story. That Zechariah thing, God has not forgotten. What an incredible promise that still resonates today, I think. God has not forgotten his word to the people that are listening to this. Maybe you're listening to this right now. That's why this story is so incredible and so important. It's why we need to hear every facet of it, because it's just proclaiming and declaring promises to us throughout this whole story. So, if you're in Luke chapter 2, if you're listening to the podcast, go to Luke 2 and you go to it. Let's get into the story and we'll find out if this is really fact or fiction. It says, in the days of Caesar Augustus, he issued a decree that is a census that should be taken of the entire Roman world. So this is a census of Rome, and they find out, okay, we need to go back to where, I think it says, and everyone went to their own town to register. And so apparently Joseph's town was Bethlehem. And so the reason they leave Nazareth to go to Bethlehem is because of this census. Is that fact or fiction?
That is, it's fact with the caveat.
Oh,
When we take what Luke is saying here of the whole Roman world, we have no record of there being a full census of the whole Roman world. How it probably would be a better way to read it would be the whole Roman region. And that would then make sense as to why people are returning to their home, because in the land of Israel and the surrounding areas, you have this understanding that land does not change hands over periods of times. It might for temporary periods, but on the Jubilee year, if you sold your family's land, guess what? That comes back to you.
wow.
And so in the Roman world, you go to Turkey, you go to Greece, you sell your land, that's it. You don't have any rights to it anymore. But inside Israel, if Joseph's family, who's from Bethlehem, because we see he's of the line of David, sells their land, they get it back in the Jubilee year. And so if there's a census that's taking place, it doesn't matter where they're living. The land that they're being taxed on is the land that they ancestrally own. And so that is what I would say when it comes to that, is that it's not probably the whole world, but it's just that whole region of the Roman Empire that is taking place in.
So Joseph he has land then, which is why he would go back there. Like that's his home. It's where he's from, but he has a reason to go back, is what you're saying then.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And he stays back according to Matthew's gospel. When we take the two stories and put them together, he's going to be there for at least 2 years after he comes back to pay his taxes.
Okay. And we're going to come back to that too, of how we know that as well. With another part of the story. So they hear there's a census. Mary is now pregnant. Joseph, so is this fact or fiction? Mary is visited by an angel, which is crazy, that tells her she's going to become pregnant without ever being with a man. That's insane. And then she gets pregnant. And then an angel. I mean, is that fact or fiction?
That's fact.
That happened.
That happens.
And then Joseph, who finds out about it, is like going to put her away quietly, and an angel visits him and says what she's telling you is true. I mean, angels are very involved in this story. That it's true, and Joseph takes her. They're betrothed. Weren't they betrothed when this happened? So
yes.
What does that mean to be betrothed?
So it's a deeper understanding than we might think of like engagement inside our world. But what would happen is that Joseph would save up a significant amount of money to essentially buy Mary. It would serve as the dowry, because when you're looking at the value that women played inside the familial role, they don't play a huge role inside your own personal family if you're the father of a daughter, because her role now is to provide sons for another family. And so you spend all this time raising her and everything like that. And then when another family comes and they have a son that needs a wife to provide him with sons to be heirs, then you are essentially selling your daughter to them, or they're paying you for all the years of doing that. They give you money, and then they have to provide a house for her, which takes 1-2 years maybe if they're poorer. And so that's the stage that we find Joseph in, is that he has already paid Mary's father the dowry price for her, and he's in the time of preparation that once he raises enough funds to build them a dwelling place, then the marriage takes place and they are officially joined together.
So he's already kind of purchased this and
Yes.
paid that bill, and then the census occurs, and he realizes, okay, now we were going to live in Nazareth. Apparently he's employed, and then the census occurs, and so as the story is told, Mary is almost 9 months pregnant. She abords a donkey. They take the long journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem, betrothed when they leave, and yet somehow married when they get to Bethlehem. And upon arriving in Bethlehem on a dark night with little snow flurries in the air and a star in the sky, they go from town to town as people are having a party, because this is Christmas apparently, and everybody's there with their families, and there's no room in the hotel that was there. And because there's no room in the hotel, there's this humble little barn that had some sheep and animals in it that we don't know who owned them, but they're there, and they have personalities because they all have a story to tell and some kid production, so they can all, talk to like humans. And then Mary goes by herself with Joseph, and Joseph somehow delivers little baby Jesus, or he stands outside as Mary delivers the baby herself and puts it into a wooden manger with hay on it. And then we all feel really incredible. And now let's open the presents. Is that fact or fiction?
That is entirely fiction, unfortunately.
Oh, no. We just messed up everybody's Christmas.
Cancel it.
So let's break it down. Let's start.
All right.
If the whole thing is fiction, let's break it down and find out what the truth is. They leave from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Explain what's going on there.
So it seems that they get married in in Nazareth, which would make perfect sense, that as soon as you have this understanding of the census that's taking place, that assumes that Joseph's family's land, which has been sold to somebody else probably, or he has no right to it at the moment, is being returned to him, which means now firstly he has the dwelling place that's needed for them, and so they can get married no problem at that point. And the fact that he understands now what's going on, because the visitation of the angel obviously makes him ready and prepared, because it says he's a pious man, and even his actions show that they want to get married, and so they get married there.
So it says. So you're saying that they're probably married in Nazareth? Is that right?
I would think so.
Okay, and then go ahead.
And they head down to Bethlehem. There's room for them to be married in Bethlehem too. It's up to how we read the text, because when we're talking about how Greek sentence structure is set up, there's ambiguity of how we can translate that, how we can read it. Perfectly fine. It doesn't change any of the story, frankly.
Right.
but it would seem that they are headed down there, and they're not going when Mary is 9 months pregnant, unfortunately. I know we love
Or
that picture of a
fortunately
pregnant
for Mary.
on a dog.
Yeah, for real.
Or fortunately for Mary.
Yeah, that would have killed the baby, unfortunately. That would have been an absolute devastation of taking a baby on that, let's say, 7, 8, maybe even 9-day journey on a donkey over relatively rough terrain. They would have done it as early as possible in her pregnancy. So we're talking maybe 5, 6 months or so.
Wow. So, and is this happening in December?
No. Well, the journey or the birth? Let me start with that.
The journey and the birth. When is all of this taking place?
So the birth, the earliest church fathers that talk about the dating of the birth of Jesus put it in between the end of March and the middle or the later part of April. They say usually between March 23rd and April 21st. Wow. And the story that of the gospel in the Gospels lines up with that, because the reason why you see the shepherds outside of Bethlehem is historically for the preparation of the Passover. What happens on Passover is you have to each family gives an unblemished lamb as a sacrifice. And if you're coming from the areas of Nazareth, for example, if you have an unblemished lamb, the chances of that lamb getting to Jerusalem after 7 days unblemished is going to be near impossible. I mean, lambs are stupid animals. And so you're going to have that reality of what you have to do is sell your unblemished lamb in Nazareth. Then when you get down to Jerusalem, you buy a lamb as its replacement. And so what you have happening outside of Jerusalem, Bethlehem is right outside of Jerusalem, is you have shepherds that are tending their flocks in preparation for bringing them into Jerusalem. And the closer you get to Passover, the closer you are going to be to the city of Jerusalem, so that there's minimal risk to these sheep when you're transporting them in large number into Jerusalem for the sacrifices. And as Passover is based off of the lunar calendar and changes throughout the year, as we even see to this day. You can have Passover and Easter, for example, in March or in April or so. The church fathers recognize that, and they put that all together, and they tell us it looks like, from the text itself, that Jesus is being born right before Passover.
Wow. Well, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So then the journey was probably happening around December, January when they go down, do you think? Yep. Or okay,
maybe even November. Yeah,
maybe even November. You know, my wife was born on December 25th, and they used to tell her all the time, "You were born on Jesus's birthday." And then she found out it wasn't. And she's like, "What a ripoff!"
My whole life is a lie.
It's a lie. So then she comes in, or Mary and Joseph come in early. You're saying, so this whole thing of arriving and she having the baby the night they get there, it didn't happen that way. So they come in, like, then what's up with this? There was no room in the inn thing. I mean, what is that all about? Did they show up? Did the family know they were coming? Were they able to tell them we're coming? They obviously have family there, right? And what's going on with all of that?
So I'm gonna break some hearts here, but there is no inn, there is no innkeeper, and this comes from the reality of one of the most egregious mistranslations of text that has then turned into tradition over time. We have in Luke's gospel this statement, because there was no room in the inn, but the problem with that is the fact that what Luke is specifically saying, that there was no room in, is not an inn. And for some reason, when we translated the Bible into English during specifically the King James Version, we have the translators mistranslate this because they don't know what Luke is referring to. However, it seems that they are able to correctly translate it in later texts, and so it's very questionable in that aspect. But no, what Luke says is that there's no room in the upper room. And how houses were set up inside the days of Jesus' day, specifically in Bethlehem and in certain other areas, is that you built your house up against a cave because it was basically free real estate. And you build your house with 3 different levels on it. And the middle level would be the area where you have kind of the family's main gathering place of eating and doing household gathering. The upper room would be the area where you would sleep during the colder months and where you would do some of the more important jobs inside the house. And the lower area of the house, the lowest one that was built into the cave, that would be the area where you do all of the housework, the cooking, the sewing, the building, things like that, and you bring the animals in there at night in order for their protection. If you go to Bethlehem today, you can actually even see the remains of houses that have these, that are built into these caves and have these little openings for the animals to come in and out of the cave with a separate entrance for the people to come in and out. And so these houses are built in this way. And what's being said by Luke is not that there's no room in the inn, because like I said, Luke knows the word for inn. It's not that he doesn't know it. He uses it, for example, in the story of the Good Samaritan, when the Good Samaritan takes the man who's left bloody and beaten on the side of the road, and he drops him off at an inn, pandexion in the Greek. Luke's word here that he uses is kataluma, and the kataluma is that upper room. And so what he's saying is that there was no room in that upper room, which would be the room that you'd usually give birth in, probably because all of Joseph's family was there. Everybody, his cousins, his brothers, everybody in the family, if he has to come back for the census, they do too, because it's all of their ancestral homelands. Anybody who is of that line of David has to come back to David and Jesse, their ancestral lands. And so the birth itself inside the ancient world is one of the most dangerous times for a woman when it comes to their life and the life of their child, because infant mortality rates were so high. And so it's all hands on deck. Not only is Joseph going to be there assisting with the birth, but any other female in the family who's given birth and experienced this is going to be there. You're going to have midwives. You're going to have everybody that you can in order to give the mother and the child the best fighting chance at surviving such an experience. And so the fact that the whole family is there, you're going to have multiple people that can be involved in this. And so you don't want to put them in this tight room. If you can fit everybody down in the basement to be able to be hands on deck here, then that's what you're going to do. And so they're giving birth down there, and they're going to place Jesus after that birth in the easiest cradle, a manger that's literally right there. It's already got hay, which is perfect for keeping your heat, your body heat. Even today, farmers use it for barn cats and stuff like that. It's perfect. It's the best opportunity to keep Jesus nice and warm during all of this situation.
So not necessarily part of the traditional story of Christmas, because in the traditional story of Christmas, it never really talks about the family of Joseph. Yeah. It essentially, you think they must be somewhat disconnected, because in the traditional story, it's like we're going back there because that's where I'm from, but it's almost like their family doesn't accept them. When you look at this biblically, do you see that Jesus is actually being accepted by his family through Joseph? Joseph, Mary, and Jesus are being accepted? Or do you feel, or is there some, because of how she got pregnant, where there's disbelief that they kind of, being a pious family, they reject Mary, thinking they're lying or exaggerating or not telling? How do we interpret that?
There are 2 ways to interpret it, or two aspects of interpreting it. I would say is that it's interesting that Joseph is constantly called pious. And there are a couple little breadcrumbs that are created by the gospel writers to add to the effect of his piousness, because something that we see inside the cultural traditions of southern Israel and the Galilee, or northern Israel, inside the days of Jesus, is a lack of piousness down in the south. And there is a great scholar who's passed away by the name of Raymond Brown, who published a paper talking about the reality of the statement that Joseph had not had intercourse with Mary, even though they are betrothed, because in the South, that was something that was completely accepted. Once you paid the dowry for her, even though you weren't married or even though you weren't living together, you were allowed to engage in intercourse with her. Whereas if you're more pious in the North, you did not do that until the completion of the betrothal period, the completion of the full marriage ceremony. And so we wouldn't expect to see that from Joseph's family if they're from the South. Joseph, being this pious is that he doesn't even touch Mary even though they're betrothed, shows that he upholds to probably a different level of piousness than what we traditionally find in the South. To say that directly about his family, there's a little bit of speculation when it comes to that, but that's genuinely the trend that we would find inside the South. But the fact that they stay there after the fact that we find that they're there for 2 years shows that there doesn't seem to be any type of rejection when it comes to Mary and Joseph. And we find even when Joseph and Mary return back to Nazareth and Jesus grows up, there seems to be no disconnect between Joseph and Jesus as Jesus' father. In Luke chapter 4, for example, when Jesus is speaking inside the synagogue and gets kicked out of the synagogue of Nazareth, one of the questions they say, "Isn't this Joseph's son?" And so there's clearly no question inside people's minds of, well, is there a scandalous nature behind this birth of Jesus? They readily accept him as Jesus' son. Or sorry, as Joseph's son.
As Joseph's son. They don't necessarily buy into the story that an angel came to Mary and said that God himself was going to impregnate her.
I don't think Mary is going there publicly and putting these out there, because as Luke's gospel tells us, Mary treasures these things in her heart.
In her heart, yeah.
Interesting.
And so I can't see her putting out the banner on the outside front lawn saying, "We're pregnant," parentheses, with an angel.
Yeah, right.
Even the fact of her being pregnant wasn't really like an issue because his family was, that would have been like a regular thing. Like when you were betrothed and then you get pregnant, it's like, so whether it be by an angel telling her or not, it's like, it's not really a big deal. So it wasn't like, oh, like we can't like be with you, like you dishonor us. It's just like, oh, that's kind of what's expected. But Joseph is, holds himself to a different standard. So yeah, interesting.
Is this fact or fiction? Joseph was quite a bit older than Mary, and Mary was about 13 years old.
That's fact.
That in our culture, that's like, what?
Yeah.
How does that fit in the culture of that time? I mean, because we look at it from here and we think that's like, even getting married. I mean, that's
Don't
like
say that word.
Oh,
You're gonna get us flagged. I had to take that out.
that's like, that's bad. What is the culture like at that period of time? That's.
Well, there's two aspects. First of all, you're looking at the life expectancy of people inside that day and age. It's much lower than it is today. You're talking about average life expectancy, probably about 40 years old. But then also you have the tradition in Judaism that you are an adult at 13 years old.
Wow.
So, for example, when we see Jesus, or I should say by 13 years old, even by 12 years old. So when we see Jesus in the temple, for example, later in Luke's gospel, the only narrative that we have of Jesus' childhood, it's not that he's being disobedient to Mary and Joseph, is that he is considered under Jewish law at that time, he's an adult. And so Mary is being viewed that way. And even though there's a mass age gap in between them, there are reasons that oftentimes explain that, which were acceptable in society in that day and age. If Joseph has to purchase Mary, that means that he has to save up for her. And we know without a shadow of a doubt that Joseph is absolutely dirt poor. We see when they give the sacrifice for Jesus, what's called the redemption of the firstborn after Jesus is born, they give 2 turtle doves. And the reality is that that's the poor man's sacrifice. That's the lowest of the low. And everything that we know about Joseph is that he's a pious man, and if he could give more, there's no question he would have given more, but he doesn't have it, which means that he has taken probably 17, 18 years to save up just to be able to purchase a bride, because he spends so much of his time probably studying Torah, about half of his day, which is something else that we see inside the New Testament, where Paul is spending half of his day working and the other half of his day teaching students and discipling them. That was common throughout Judaism. That that was what you did. If you wanted to learn God's word and you wanted to have it ingrained in your heart, you spent half the day working and you sacrificed the other half of the day's wages for the study of God's word. And so that's going to keep someone poor. That's going to make them not be able to afford to purchase a bride until they're significantly older.
Wow.
Interesting.
So Joseph and Mary get to Bethlehem. How long do you think they were there? Is there any way to know how long they would have been in Bethlehem before Jesus would have been born?
We don't necessarily know. It's all speculation. It's all guess. I would say probably 2 to 3 months or so. It seems there's a connection already that when, for example, Mary tells Elizabeth that she's pregnant and John the Baptist jumps inside her womb, Elizabeth is 6 months pregnant at that period. And so we have somewhat of a time window of saying, okay, there's this and that, of putting it into perspective. Potentially there's the thought that maybe Mary is visiting Zechariah and Elizabeth on her way to Bethlehem, or maybe meeting Joseph there. We don't necessarily know. I would say maybe 3 months, maybe 6 months, who knows?
Well, that messes up the entire story.
Do you have to rewrite any of your sermon for this week?
No, fortunately I've heard this before, but there are some people thinking about this right now going, oh my goodness, Grandmama has lied to me.
Yeah.
So they're there. Now let's shift from the story with Joseph and Mary and Jesus. Let's go over to the shepherds.
Yes.
The story of the shepherds is they're guarding their sheep by night. And as they're sitting there, just gazing into the sky, a choir of angels shows up singing it has one of those pop-up things in the mall, where they sing that Hallelujah song. Hallelujah. Yeah, okay.
I was going to let you sing.
Yeah, I know you were. And they have this pop-up moment, and they say the Savior has been born to mankind, and then the shepherds stand up and rejoice, and they follow the angels as they go to the manger, and they stand. Well, baby Jesus is in what we thought was a wooden manger. Now it's a mason manger with hay, and little baby Jesus with a glow over him is sitting there, and the animals are around, and the shepherds come with their staff, and they come and they stand and they look at baby Jesus. Is that fact or fiction?
It is fact.
And
how it is fact, and how it's portrayed, at least inside the Gospels, is that they're out there in the field, and the angel appears. One angel first appears to them, and then he's joined by a host of angels who declare what's happening. And when the angels leave, they desire to go and find the child. And so you have that narrative, and it's interesting. I love that narrative, actually, especially because of the announcement of what's being made there to them. As first of all, we oftentimes portray the shepherds as being these kind of lowly individuals. They are not lowly individuals at all. They are actually well revered in society because of the role that they're playing. These are not any ordinary shepherds, like I said before. These are the ones that are overseeing the sheep of the sacrificial lambs that are going to be used on Passover. And so it's unique that they're the first ones that are told about this gospel, that go seeking and searching for Jesus where they find him. Right outside the city, or I say the city of Bethlehem, the town of Bethlehem. But yeah, we have that narrative in Luke chapter 2 right there.
So interesting.
That's incredible, actually. And this is part of what when we were in Israel, when you think that these were the sacrificial lambs being raised on the hills of Bethlehem, and Jesus, the Lamb of God, is born on the hill of Bethlehem. And then the shepherds who are caring for the sheep receive the announcement of the sheep that really validate, like they've been raising these sheep potentially most of their life, and the sheep that validates everything they've been raising is now been born, and they come, and now they're standing and looking at this little baby wrapped in swaddling clothes. Is it true, Jeremy? And we heard this when we were in Israel, that often lambs were wrapped in swaddling type strips of cloth when they were born, and Jesus was almost treated like a lamb would be treated when it's born. Is that true, or is that fiction?
That's fiction. That is a later interpretation that is added in by the early church, but that's not something that we see of this whole idea of the lambs being wrapped up in swaddling clothes. It preaches well. It sounds well.
You just ruined my message.
Yeah, for real.
Tells me that, but no, it's there's actually a great scholar by the name of Wave Nunley who just published an article about this as well, talking about the fact that it is later tradition that is then implanted onto the text or supplanted onto the text rather than something that's birthed out of the first century.
So then, was Jesus wrapped in swaddling clothes?
Yes. Yeah. That'd
what would that have been? What would swaddling? What is that? Why is it mentioned in there with such detail that he was wrapped in? Like, is there anything tied to that?
It's just the mention of basically that he's being wrapped up in a manner that they can identify him in, that he's brand newborn, that he needs something to keep his body heat up, basically.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's showing, in my opinion, it's showing the fact that he is just born rather than a child that is days old, because the statement that's made by the angels is today the child is born. So
the angels are there when he's newly born. I mean, they're coming when he's newly born. And you don't know if it's evening or day, although we want to believe it's evening because the dark backdrop.
The angels say this night.
But
yes.
But would the angels or would the shepherds have gone right then to the manger then? Probably.
I absolutely think so.
Okay.
The statement is, "Come, let us find this." It's they understand the gravity of what's taking place, because when we look at the worship of the angels, we miss something. I actually just preached on this a couple weeks ago. We miss something that's being said because there's a direct tie-in to Isaiah 53 with the suffering servant and what's going on there, where we find God's good pleasure, what we oftentimes translate as on whom God's favor rests and on whom God is pleased. The better translation would be the understanding of God's good pleasure rests upon man. And God's good pleasure is identified in Isaiah 53 as saying it pleased the Lord to crush the suffering Messiah. And this is something that Paul reiterates, for example, in Ephesians chapter 1, Ephesians chapter 3, this idea that's wrapped up into all of this. And so there's a nuance in the praise that the shepherds, if they know their Bibles, which they would have, that's first century Judaism, they're being told right there, guess what? The one who is the Messiah is here right now. And we're not joking around.
Wow. Okay, so we're going to have to unwrap that one at another point in time.
Pun intended?
Yeah. Okay, so the shepherds show up. They're at the site, and we can't forget the three wise men, because three wise men must have been very prophetic, or the star appeared ahead of time, because somehow they showed up in the nativity scene with the human-speaking, English-speaking, or Hebrew-speaking animals who could talk, and then the shepherds, which, animals is fiction for anyone who's listening, as fiction. How we view the nativity. The shepherds are there. We always think three shepherds, but it doesn't state a number of shepherds, right?
Nope. No number of shepherds, nor any number of wise men.
Right, or wise men as well, not three wise men? Why do we think there are three wise men?
We've got three gifts, so we assume each one brought one.
That's crazy. And so if they're not three, then how many do you think there were? And were they at so the wise men come bearing gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and they're at the birth of Jesus. They're with the shepherds right there. Is that fact or fiction?
That is fiction. They do not show up for another 2 years.
So 2 years later, which is why we know that Jesus was in Bethlehem for 2 years. So if he didn't have room in an inn, where was he staying for 2 years?
That's a good point.
They were staying at a house. They had a house.
They had a house.
Joseph is going back to his family's land. They've got land, they've got houses, and if as we assume things are transferring in order for the taxation, he's getting whatever parcel of land is allotted to him based off of his family's allotment. And the text says that is that when the wise men arrive in Bethlehem, at the house where Mary and Joseph were at. So it's telling us that they're at a house, that they're living, they're cemented down in Bethlehem at that point.
And how many wise men do you think there were? I mean, if it's not three, is it a big crowd? Is it a little crowd, or a lot of people? Like, and then it says they're being led by a star in the sky, and that's bringing them to Bethlehem. But there's like, if I'm looking at it, I'm a little confused because they go to Jerusalem first and they ask, where does the prophecy say? And there's a spiritual leader says that he would be born in Bethlehem, I think is.
Yep.
Okay. So tell me a little bit, what's going on with the wise men thing? Are they led by a star in the sky? Is there a star? And Jesus was born 2 years before they even get there. So is this star of, because we say it's the star of Jesus there.
Yeah.
Like when Jesus was on earth, was there always a star identifying where he was? And maybe that's how all the people found out where he was going, in ministry. They just followed the star. Like what's going on there?
So what we translate as star, the better translation could be luminary, which simply just means a light in the sky. And so I am of the thought process that what we're seeing here is probably the Shekhinah, which is the visual Holy Spirit or the Spirit of God that we find inside the Old Testament that leads Israel when they're wandering in the wilderness by night. That rests upon the Temple of Solomon when the presence of the Lord is there before it departs in the days before Babylon comes. And so that's what I am assuming that they are seeing. And we just translate it as star because it's a lot easier to translate that way when we look at the term luminary. But it's clear that they see something in the sky. And we actually find that they are not the only ones that are looking in the skies for something to come out of Judea, especially a ruler of the world, because Suetonius, the Roman historian, tells us that there were others that were actively looking for that, and he equates the ruler of the world to come out of Judea to be the Emperor Vespasian, who wins in the year of the four emperors, this time when you're having a changeover of emperors really quickly, and he's portrayed to be the emperor by the armies of Rome, and he ends up ascending to the throne. But Suetonius saying this tells us that it's clear that people are actively looking for a sign inside the skies for some type of ruler. And so these magi see this, and they come probably in a mass number of them, because it says when they got to Jerusalem, the whole city was in a buzz at their presence. The magi, from what we see about them inside the writings of the Greek historian Herodotus, for example, is that they were the kingmakers of the Persian world. They were the ones that you did not ascend to the throne without getting their thumbs up or their approval. And they, in all essence, they held more power than the kings themselves. Wow. The kings would seek their approval as to whether or not to go to war. They would bring them along with them when they went to war. It's incredibly telling of their power. And notice how when they get to Jerusalem, they have immediate access to King Herod. It's not like they're waiting there for a while. They immediately get ushered into the king's chambers, and they ask him, in my opinion, one of the dumbest questions that they could ask inside that manner: where is it to be born the King of the Jews? To the one who is proclaimed to be the King of the Jews. Wow. They clearly didn't have a whole lot of nuance or tact there, but they asked this question of what they're literally looking for. Herod doesn't know. He calls his attendants in. They tell them Bethlehem. They travel to Bethlehem, but the luminary that they see in the sky is clearly moving, and it says it moves to be over the house that they are staying in. Wow. And so that's what leads them to the house there. And then we have this understanding of how it's 2 years later, because of the fact that Herod gives the order after he questions them and finds out when the first moment that they saw the star in the sky or the luminary in the sky was, he sends them, he says, come back and tell me so I can worship the child too. Really, he seeks to kill Jesus. They end up being warned, and they go another route. They go to the south and return back. And Herod sends his guard into Bethlehem to kill all the baby boys 2 years of age and younger. And so that's telling us that this is about 2 years has passed by now.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, you think they must have been somebody, because Herod was afraid of losing power. He was paranoid, especially toward the end of his life. The fact that he doesn't kill them, all the magi that come, means there's a lot of them, or they're extremely powerful, and he knew if he does that, it would not go well with him to kill them, just because of his paranoia. And you're looking for someone. I mean, if you go in the presence of Herod, you'd probably want to measure what you were saying. Wouldn't that be correct? I mean, so the fact they do it means they must have been pretty powerful.
Is it true that there was Chinese astronomers that saw the same star in the sky during that time?
That has been stated, yes, that there's this idea. Now, here's the thing, is whether or not, when we're taking ancient worlds timelines and trying to make them match together, that can be difficult, and there's a lot of variance that can come with it. We have that, for example, when we're using the Bible to try to date what's happening in Egypt. That's And so it has been hypothesized by some that one of the things that is being seen right there is the same thing that's being described at that same period in China. Or potentially what you're having as well is Halley's Comet, which comes about 50 years earlier, which is actually used by Caesar Augustus to cement his control of the imperial cult, saying that that's the soul of Julius Caesar that's ascending to the heavens, because it says that for a period of a number of days you could see the comet with your own eyes during the daytime. And so is there a variance of 30 to 50 years that's taking place in between these two calendars? That's completely possible.
Wow. Interesting.
Yeah, the wise men, that's something, because we sing, the song, "We three kings of Orient are," thinking, I mean, you would assume they're Chinese kings, right? And that's not at all what they were. So, and I've heard it said too that because of the number of Jewish people that in the diaspora that were spread out, went to Babylon, and then Persian defeated Babylon, and the Persian Empire was quite large. A number of religious people would have not only tried to adapt Jewish way of religion, which would have been pretty difficult, I think, with most Jews at that. Isn't it funny that when the Jewish people were out in other nations, they held on stronger to their faith than when they were in Israel itself? They tended to abandon all of the faith, and then when they get it's just crazy. But many of these spiritual leaders in Persia picked up on the teachings of the Jews that were kind of interspersed and intermingled in with them. Is that true?
Absolutely. I mean, we see it inside the biblical text that Persia deals very favorably with the Jewish people and almost has a fascination with them. We see when Persia overtakes Babylon, Daniel becomes one of really the highest advisors there to the local king, King Darius. But then we also see a Jewish Persian queen in Esther. We see Cyrus the Great allowing the Jewish people to go back to Jerusalem and build their temple. And then you see Artaxerxes Artaxerxes, the son of Xerxes. He allows the Jewish people to go back and build the walls in Nehemiah's day of Jerusalem, which is unheard of. And so clearly the Jewish people are in a favorable place inside the Persian Empire that would absolutely have that intermingling of the higher Persian religious system that would be trying to understand who these Jewish people are and even adapt their cultures into their own. That was just what the ancient world did, is that when you had other people inside your world, you wanted to know them, you wanted to understand them, and you wanted to take the best aspects of their religion and bring it into your own world.
What do you think that the presence of the Magi in this story can really tell us today about all of this? In my mind, I'm thinking, as I think about it, and you can either add or undercut it or say it's not right or whatever, but he was the king, not just to the Jews. It's almost as though he's saying, these kingmakers. You said you couldn't be a king unless you went through it was like God used a people and said, he's not just the king of the Jews, he's the king of the world through the Magi. It's like the Magi's presence tells us he was king over the world, not just a people group.
Absolutely. That's always what I take from it, because we find it missed, and especially inside first century Judaism, they miss the reality of why they are set apart from the rest of the world. Why is Abraham called, and why are his descendants blessed? It's so that they will represent God to who? To the peoples, to the world. That's why Israel exists and why they are chosen to basically serve as emissaries of God to the lost world. When you get to the first century, when the Messiah comes, it's funny because only one of Jesus's disciples really seems to understand the reality that the Messiah is not just a Jewish construct, but the Messiah is someone who has come for the world as a whole. And that's Judas, who is not Iscariot. He asks Jesus, why have you appeared just to us and not to the entire world? But really, Jesus had done that right from the very beginning. And it's showing that right from his very birth, that the Messiah was there for all of mankind.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I think the part of it, when you understand that part, this whole story is incredible. You have wise men come from a ways away. You have these shepherds that are credible people in society. They're going to share what they saw and their experience with the people of Jerusalem. I've always wondered how, with that type of experience, how it didn't translate to later in Jesus's ministry. Like, did they just forget it? Was there amnesia? When those wise men went back, weren't they declaring and proclaiming this baby? And then what happened from there? Like, what is it? It always interests me to try to find out, like someday, whether it's an eternity, to figure out what did those wise men do? What did the Magi do? What did the shepherds do?
True.
And how was he forgotten? When Tiger Woods was a little boy, he went on not Jay Leno, but on Johnny Carson, and he was hitting golf balls, right? And everybody watched him after that to see what Tiger was going to do through the years, so that even when Tiger went to college, everybody remembered him from Johnny Carson. It wasn't like they forgot this. This is the king of the world. Angels announce his coming. There is a luminary in the sky that leads Magi to this place. And then we don't, what happened?
Yeah.
Like, what happened after that? Do you know what took place, or do you have an idea of what took place, or is it?
Nobody really does, because we just don't have it in written form. And that's the reality with so much of what's taking place in not only around Jesus, but with the New Testament as a whole, of we're only getting brief snapshots of what's going on here and there. Do I think that they absolutely had an impact when they went back? Absolutely, but it's nothing that we can prove, because we don't have the record of what happens when missionaries start taking the gospel to Persia in the first century or the second century, and they get there and maybe they hear someone saying, oh, I heard about that, I remembered that, or that type of thing. We just don't have the record of it. I'd say that we maybe know of such a small glimpse of what's really happening, first of all, in the ministry of Jesus, because John tells us, he says, this is just a small amount. If I were to write everything that I witnessed in Jesus's ministry, there are not enough pages inside the world or libraries inside the world to contain the amount of stories that I have about Jesus's ministry. And now take that even further, where when we look at what's going on in the New Testament period, when the gospel starts spreading out and interacting with these new places, we don't have any records of that. One prime example that I use is that we don't have any solid records of the Apostle Thomas going to the land of India and bringing the gospel, but we know without a shadow of a doubt that it happened because of the amount of people coming out of India with the surname Thomas in later periods as a result. And so you see the evidence, but you don't necessarily know the exact accounts of what happened. That's what I think we're dealing with, is that when they go back, they're absolutely telling exactly what they saw. They just took a 2-year journey to get there. 4 years go by, they walk in the door, and everybody says, where have you been for 4 years? I guarantee they're telling people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I disappeared for 4 years, my wife would want to know exactly where I went.
Right. And not only, it's not just three, it's an entourage.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they're bringing gold, frankincense, which we understand have meaning in some ways of themselves, of what they did, and that's a part of the story as well. Did you have any questions you wanted to ask while we were Jeremy?
Yeah, my mind is still, you know how I work when we were in Israel. It's like the tour guide and we're in these places. I feel like, Pastor James was my tour guide to Israel because he had just gone there, and he's like asking me, "Do you have anything to say about this?" Because we were filming content, and I'm just sitting there like still trying to wrap my brain around being in Israel, seeing all this, and then learning everything that you had just thought like as a tradition. You're like, okay, I gotta kind of like wipe off the table and then like rebuild everything that I just assumed, like just like what you had said, all the traditions that you're familiar with. You're like, Jeremy just destroyed everything in my mind.
You know what's interesting about this is I was at a seniors luncheon and I was sharing some of what I had listened to on and I would encourage you, if you're listening to this podcast, a great one to listen to is, do you have a podcast, Jeremy?
I do not.
You don't, but Center of Holy Land Studies does, and it's great perspective. It's just great, and so you put in CHLS and YouTube or whatever, and you'll find that their podcast there. But I was sharing some of the things that we had heard when we were in Israel. And in some listening to one of the podcasts that Jeremy had, and I shared the Christmas story and how it was so different than what we remember. And one of the older ladies said, "I just like the one I grew up with." and I laughed and I said, "Isn't it funny? Because human nature often prefers tradition over truth." And the problem is, and Jesus even refers to that. He says, "You serve your traditions, but your hearts are far from me." Like truth, Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth." And all truth, our pursuit in this adventure with Christ should always be to really know truth. And you say, well, how is the story changing, going to change my life? It's more than just trying to practically find out how it's going to change your life. It's coming closer to the truth of it. It's understanding the truth of it, because so many Christians today, their faith is being undermined because some teacher comes along and they've been told something their whole life, and then they come along and they undermine what they've been told, and then they throw the baby out with the bathwater. They think because the story they heard was wrong or not told true to the historical narrative, then they think the principles of that are wrong. You know, you lied to me about, and I think when you hear this, when you read it, now you're going to read it different.
Yeah, it's exciting.
And if you think of there's no room in the inn and you read it, you think it's a hotel. Yeah. But after Jeremy talks about, it's just a great part of it. The inn isn't a hotel. It's actually the house, and there was no room in this part of the house. And so they're moving it to, whoa, okay, so that
whole new
totally
meaning
changes. And that's why, that's another incredible example of why going to Israel and thinking of it, I would never have said we should take a pilgrimage because we don't, but we have to. I mean, to take a pilgrimage back to the place where all of this took place with people who understand the culture of the time, it's worth every penny you pay to do that, and strengthening your faith and how you read the word. And, this is just this great example. And I want to say thank you to Jeremy for taking time out of your busy schedule and joining us and just helping us understand the Christmas story as it was, really, and not just tradition.
Yeah, it's definitely a treat. If you guys are listening to this right now, we do have a trip coming up. So if there's people online that want to be a part of that, what should they do?
Well, the trip happens right after Labor. In fact, I think it's on Labor Day where you guys leave it, either Labor Day, and Jeremy is going on that trip. Jeremy is actually going to be here at Bethel's Rock in January, and he's going to share a little bit for a couple minutes on that. We'd have him speak, but we already have that scheduled all out. He's going to speak, and then they're going to do something that night, that Sunday night as well, for anyone that's in the area that wants to come to be part of it. If you're online, you just need to email us, and maybe we can Zoom them into that meeting with Jeremy in January, and you can ask questions.
Because I know there's people I know in our online campus that have been interested when we did our series from Israel, and I'm letting you know now that it's a possibility. You can come. You can email me at pastoralex@bethelsrock.org, and I'll set you up with the info that you need.
And the incredible part is, and I can't state this enough, Jeremy is going to be on this trip. What's amazing is if Jeremy doesn't know, he'll say, I don't know, and you saw that even in this, but it's pretty hard to stump this guy on some things. And there are things that what I love about Jeremy is you can disagree with him and he doesn't get his feelings hurt. He pushes back and forth. So I've already told people that are going to Israel, I said, if you think something, you need to believe something. It's what you believe. And so if you don't agree with what he's saying, tell them why, and that discussion will help develop what you believe. Like a lot of times, how I learn a lot of stuff is I'll argue with a person about what they're saying, and because if what they're saying is true, I want to believe it too. Mm-hmm. And that back and forth, and Jeremy is very good at that. Center of Holy Land Studies is, in my opinion, is one of the best organization for doing this trip. We could have went with other places, but fortunately, God opened up this date in the fall, and I just really do believe that. And if you're worried about dangerous places and they've been doing this for years. They know where they can and cannot take you. If it's dangerous, they're not going to take you. We'll postpone the trip, but you'll have already paid for it. So it will be postponed to another time. I don't think that's going to happen. I believe we're going to be able to do it in September. And but Jeremy, thank you for being a friend of Bethel's Rock and a friend of the Kingdom of God.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Thank you guys for listening. Again, if you have any questions or topics you want us to cover, or you just want to figure out how do I get on the Israel trip, because I'm mad the podcast is done because I want to keep hearing from Jeremy, you can email me at pastoralex@bethelsrock.org. We love you guys, and we will see you.
Before we see you again, we also have some clips. When I was in Turkey, and I've interviewed Jeremy and Dr. Emmanuel, and so look for those online as well, and you'll see some stuff on. You said, what's the diaspora? Jeremy explains that. It's one of my favorite short clips that you'll want to watch, and what that is. So now you can go ahead and take that. Goodbye.
I always kind of look Jeremy in the corner of my eye, because he always I got one more. We love you guys. We will see you next week for another episode.